I mean, and that's an interesting point you make about the fact that the Tigray people, or the people in Tigray, would actually be taking on the burden of the damages that the TPLF has done by starting this war. And it seems to me that's what they also had to take on when the war started. I mean, I do think there were some atrocities like the UN High Commissioner report found on all sides. And I just have to think like a person and consider that some of these forces on, that were with the Ethiopian government, allied forces, were, this war started overnight. There's a lot of adrenaline pumping. The army base was attacked in a very gruesome way. Some of the soldiers were killed and paraded around their bodies, from what I was able to understand. And the people themselves in Tigray were told, these are your enemies that are coming in, after an action like that was taken by the TPLF. So essentially, instead of just bowing out of power and letting the people of Tigray meet a new government and decide if they liked it, peacefully, it seems to me that the TPLF, which kept much of Tigray poor during the 20 plus years that it was in power, made the people of Tigray pay for its mistakes. And it seems to be doing that over and over again without actually paying the debt to the people, which it had just going in 1991. And so there's if you look at the diaspora, and if you look at some of the commentary that comes out of the capital city of Mekelle, you might think that everybody, or a lot of people, support the TPLF. But what I think you're saying, and there's other evidence to support it, is if given the opportunity to have something different without they themselves, the people in Tigray, having to create that revolution and actually sacrifice and pay for their lives to get the TPLF out, that they would maybe actually choose it. I mean, I spoke with one friend who has family there, who said they were actually happy that there was a shift. I mean, a lot of people in that area, to your point, were happy when Abiy Ahmed came into power, because they didn't have to make that happen. It was a natural, I don't want to say natural, there was a lot of protests, but it was something that happened without them having to take on the TPLF head to head. And I've spoken with someone high in government that said, one of the worst things that happened to the people of Tigray is that we allowed the TPLF to retreat back into that region and take control. So, do you believe that if given this space, that there will be this natural separation if the Ethiopian government handles it well? And I've heard people say that they've learned a lot from the first round of war. Do you think, given enough time, the people of Tigray will be able to, broadly speaking, separate themselves from the TPLF ideology and as the political group?
Yeah, so I think this is relatively, complicated, right? Because we're trying to look into the future to a certain extent. But the way I would do it is think of it as having teeth that are sunk into your neck. And then the question is, are you trying to get your neck free, or is the teeth going to be removed from your neck? And in many cases here, the TPLF operates on the basis of incredible level of control and the installation of fear. So why, for instance, aren't many Tigrayans up in arms? Because you can still not like Abiy. That's no problem. Don't like the prime minister. That's your absolute right. Have a problem with the reform movement. That's, again, it's a political position. That's no problem. But if you care for the people and for their life, then at every single moment when there's an opportunity to stop the war, you should put the maximum pressure to stop the war, right? So what does it mean to say Tigray is going to win, and you're simply taking the most valuable things that you have, which is the new generation, young people, and you simply are going to say, go and fight, right? Go and fight, go and die. So there's been several times, if you notice, November 4, you did not have to start the war if you care about the people and the life of the people. Okay, let's say that happened. Then you have the absolute travesty of the first round, and the government decides to retreat, and you have an opportunity at that time to have a political settlement, if you will, of some nature. The TPLF decides to actually invade and take the battle as possible, as much as possible, to Addis Ababa, right? So it decides for war, not for the preservation of life. There's a third attempt. right? Which is the most recent round, if you will. And the most recent round was not even for Addis Ababa because the capabilities are not there. It's not for regime change. It was for chips that can be used on a negotiating table that would allow them to have a little bit of leverage. And for that little bit of leverage, thousands of people are being killed everywhere in northern Ethiopia. Tigrayans, Amara, Wallo, Afar, etc. So is there a appreciation and evaluation of human life? Exactly how much is a Tigrayan life worth to these people? At what point are we going to say, no, this is unacceptable? This is not a politics that has any type of sense if it's killing generations of Tigrayans. And again, I don't want to also make this simply a question of Tigrayan lives. I think it's very important to understand that there are many lives that are being lost here, right? So this war is a very complex war. So the relationship with Onag Shenne and the acts that they're engaging in, which is to massacre innocents across Ethiopia, particularly selectively looking for Amara communities, is a way also, again, of propagating this war. Why? Because it's a way of trying to weaken the legitimacy of the government, to unbalance it. And that's part of the war as well. So I think on many levels, you have a, a chance here, I think, right? A chance here for Tigrayans to actually breathe. I think it's also very important for your audience members to understand that it's one thing for us to sit here and for others as well, even if you're in Addis Ababa, to say, look, you know, what, you have to move away from the TPLF. I'm going to throw you some pamphlets and explain to you that I'm on your side. um, the people that have the guns, the people that can take your life, the people that have the food aid, the medicines in their hands, the people that are demanding that a 13, a 14, a 15-year-old has to be donated in order to perhaps die, right? Otherwise, you don't get your food. These are the people that are instilling fear, right? And until the government can provide an atmosphere where there is no retribution, there is no fear of being killed, then I think it becomes very difficult, right? It becomes very difficult. The other element I think, which is very important, is also to relay the message. And the government, if they're taking those steps, they need to do much, much work on this, is to relay the message that Tigrayans are Ethiopians, that the federal government sees them as citizens, and that they are a very key constituency, that their rights and their life matter, and that this government is operating in order to ensure their lives, right, and their rights and their interests, right, just like in any sort of part of Ethiopia as well. And for the majority of Ethiopians, right, I think it's very important to understand that Ethiopians, thank goodness, have some sort of common sense and decency. It doesn't mean that we're any so different from other sort of people, because it could have taken a very, very dangerous turn, which is to say that no systematic attempt to kill Tigrayans has occurred in Ethiopia, despite the horrors of the TPLF. I mean, this should be a testament, an understanding for Tigrayans that, of course, there's a conception and understanding in Ethiopia that the people of Tigray are separate from the TPLF. And how the TPLF is seen, yes, the TPLF is despised. The TPLF is seen as having betrayed the country, the people, not the prime minister and not some party, the people. That the TPLF is no longer a legitimate actor in the eyes of many in Ethiopia. But that does not apply to the people of Tigray. It doesn't mean that a Tigrayan has no space in Ethiopia, that a Tigrayan cannot work in state institutions, cannot have positions of influence and a voice, cannot have a future. That's not what it means. And I think that message has to be relayed because there is definitely a fear, I think, and a misperception with respect to the relationship that Tigrayans perhaps have with other Ethiopians and how other Ethiopians see them, simply because of the actions of the TPLF and what we've heard and what we've seen in terms of the brutality, the things that are done that are not part of our culture. And also, I think it's also very important. War is tragic, it's brutal, it's ugly, and what the people in Tigray, because a significant chunk of this war was within the province, and so people have been seeing war, and war is ugly. You can paint it however way that you want, but there's no way that armies and various groups of armed men fighting is going to result in some sort of clean and sort of non-traumatic event. So young people, older people, all types of people were witnessing terrifying things in Tigray. So that's also a very traumatic thing that people need to also understand. And it's going to take time, but one of the ways in which you can have a post TPLF Tigray, right? Is well, one way of healing, one path is actually have a post TPLF Tigray. Maybe it's time for the TPLF to exit history.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like with them there, I don't know how things will move on. I'll be quick so that we can wrap this up. I know I'm taking up a lot of your time and you're on the East Coast, but I'm just so curious. Are you seeing people around you that maybe bought into the TPLF narrative? I mean, to your point, people from the Tigray origin or are living all over Ethiopia fine. They're excelling, they're doing well in their businesses. Yes, there was a lot of people, and not just people from Tigray, that were arrested last winter after the TPLF announced it was going to Addis Ababa. But in general, everyone's living fine. If there was an issue with Tigrayans or Ethiopians from Tigray, we would see that outside of Tigray, where the TPLF is occupied and is the sole source of information for the international community and for Ethiopians and Eritreans abroad. So first of all, how much of an impact do you think the diaspora, at least the declared Tigrayan diaspora here, has? How much of an impact do they have on what the people on the ground think? Do you think they're, connecting with them through their satellite connections, which I know some people have? I also had some level of access, depending on who you know. Is it the diaspora feeding the people in Tigray, or is it a combination, and are you seeing people in the diaspora mellow out a little bit in terms of their perspective on the conflict?
Yeah, it's really hard to generalize, right? I mean, you definitely see in terms of the diaspora how the narrative that was constructed, that this is a war to eliminate the people of Tigray, right, as a genocide, for instance, that was from the very early moment on, which was one of the most frightening things to actually hear, right? And I wanted obviously to know whether this is actually something real or not, because I have a stake in this. If this is true in terms of my own sort of family, etc. So yes, I think as things change on the ground, and as the ability for the truth, right? One of the things that has happened in this war is not just human casualty, but truth has been a casualty of this war. And the ability to actually tell the truth, find out the truth, has been extremely difficult. And so I think the ability then to recognize what has really happened in Tigray is going to slowly emerge, and that should make a difference. With respect to those that are in Tigray, on the ground in Ethiopia, I think the most important is not necessarily foreign sort of diaspora-based sort of narratives and media that's produced, which to a certain extent I think that has an influence, but it's really the power of the TPLF that has worked on the Tigrayan people for quite some time. So it's very important to recognize that, if you remember, the after November 4th, the Ethiopian military took about 2 weeks to essentially defeat the TPLF. And in that time period, the Tigrayan people welcomed the Ethiopian Defense Forces, right? It was very evident to see. So some of the mistakes that were made earlier on gave the opening to the TPLF then to engage in a way of trying to make it into a national type of conflict, meaning a Tigray-wide conflict. Otherwise, prior to that, it was seen exactly what it was, a group that had power and that had decided to go to war for power. And so the people of Tigray were completely on the sidelines, right? So I
You think
think,
so? I have to push back on that a little bit. Because there was for the year or two prior, there was so much war propaganda on the media outlets in Tigray. I mean, they're on online now and you can see them. And I remember hearing about it pre-war that what there's so much war propaganda talking about war. We've got to get ready for war. Our enemies are coming for us. So do you really think that, and again, this is, I don't want to generalize, but in general, broadly speaking, let's say, do you really think that people in Tigray didn't feel like this was their war because they had been told that it was coming, and it was about them, that it wasn't about the TPLF alone?
it's a really good question. So the extent to which a public perception management strategy, sort of a psychological warfare strategy, is able to successfully prepare a public for some event, right? That's a normal part of much of what goes on in terms of the preparation to war. So, a great example is our very own country in the United States. So, prior to the run up to the war against Iraq or the invasion of Iraq, there was a very concerted campaign to try to paint a picture of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, with having weapons of mass destruction, right? And it was found obviously to be false. And the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, General Colin Powell at the time, in his memoirs, also noted that it was one of his shameful moments to participate in constructing a falsehood in order then to achieve a political objective, to go to war. But the American public, during survey after survey, even after that weapons of mass destruction had been found to be non-existent and false, and that this was all a concocted lie, it was really remarkable. 50 to 60% of Americans continue to think that weapons of mass destruction were actually in Iraq. And so that in a way legitimized this illegal act of invasion, which is to tell you that the media can be a very powerful tool that actually does change public perceptions about reality. So there's no question that in terms of Tigray, particularly when you have literally one monopoly, all mediums are controlled by the TPLF. Narratives are constructed to heighten a sense of fear, a sense of doom, etc. Fear from the Eritreans, which just had opened the border, and you saw images of families hugging each other and crying, relatives exchanging and coming to each other's weddings and events, etc. Right? So you had to create a sense of crisis and fear around that. So, but the only difference I would add is that there was also coercion. So those that could perhaps call that into question in Tigray would be sidelined. Those that would be calling at in the safety of Addis Ababa, so the TPLF can't really kill them, jail them, harm them, would be called banda, right? People that are selling out, who are selling out Tigray, etc. So there's a way of discrediting so that no challenge could be made to this narrative, if you will. And it was very effective to a certain extent. But reality can always change that. And reality on the ground is if the TPLF is removed, if you have a federal government that's behaving in a way that is not in accordance with what the TPLF is claiming. So what I mean to say is I think what you say is correct, right? So obviously it has some impact. I would see it as making a fertile ground in people's minds that would allow for mobilization if that was made to be a possibility. So what the government did was actually, in terms of the lessons learned, was huge mistakes in terms of the first round, because that allowed the TPLF to tap into that reservoir of fear. And why? Because we see also instances in which there's mass killings, there's violations, some of which are by TPLF members who perhaps are posing as this official and this army, etc. I mean, it's very hard for me because I really have not read any type of independent material to tell us what really happened, and how can you explain the way in which the population quickly bought into kind of a narrative that they were being in siege, so to speak, right? So that is something that we'll find out eventually. And again, I think all of us are invested in truth, wherever that may lead us, right? Um, but let's just put it this way, Hermela. Right now, 2 years after one of the perhaps most tragic and dramatic sort of moments in Tigray's history, very shameful, very painful one, no one in Tigray in their right mind is going to say, let's give another year of these conditions a go. People want peace. People want to go to work. Kids want medicine. Those that are debilitated and disabled want assistance. Those that are traumatized want this to stop. So there's, just like any other sort of human community, so to speak. I think the work of the government so far has been important in the sense that areas that are controlled by the Ethiopian government, according to third party observers, whether it's the UN and NGOs, have noted that there's an element of law and order. There is no acts of retribution, that very fundamental public service is being provided to the population. That means food, that means medicine. There's also an attempt to reconstruct the damaged infrastructure, including telephones and electricity, etc. So these are the ways that you can buy the trust and shift the opinion and the perception of at least enough segment. Not everyone is going to be convinced, right? You'll still have diehards. So I am optimistic in that regard. And I think the Tigrayan people actually need our support, right? Our understanding. And they also need the federal government to help them.
Yeah.
That's the way we need to really look at this. This is not an antagonistic relationship. This is one where this is our people and they require our help. Whether it's to shift away from this kind of chokehold that the TPLF has had and the mine hold that the TPLF has had. Um, and that requires, I think, also forums like what you've opened up, where we have an opportunity to talk and to tell other people who say that they care about the Tigrayan people, start talking now before everyone is dead. Start talking now. Save lives. Don't send money to the TPLF to start another round of war.
Absolutely. I mean, you make many good points, but for the purpose of just summarizing some of our conversation and leaving with the audience with a couple of nuggets, I think, your point about the lessons that the Ethiopian government has learned in terms of how to handle the situation is very important. I've talked with government officials, including the Ethiopian defense minister, who's said this, that the people of Tigray need to be re-educated about who we are as a government, what the Ethiopian government is. And I've talked to some folks who have said that we need to make sure that we are going in with the utmost patience and explaining to the people what is actually going on, because there were mistakes made, as the Ethiopian government has admitted, arrested dozens of people, at least a few dozen, that have been accused of atrocities, and that helped the TPLF propaganda. And that's why you don't start a war to begin with, but we can't ignore that there were realities that actually fed into the idea that the Ethiopian people or the Ethiopian government were against Tigrayans as a whole. And I think also to your point about the propaganda and the narrative, we have to take control of that. I mean, it's an open secret that the Ethiopian government is not as strong in its communication as the TPLF is, and it has to get better. I do see signs that it's getting better. I see signs that the media is trying to do better, do more English language programming, take a more proactive approach in telling the stories, because I think that part will be absolutely critical in terms of reconciling with the people of Tigray and those on the outside that genuinely want to get it right.
Yeah.
So a lot of good points there. And I will say, just to leave on a positive note, I do notice the mainstream media is not picking up the stories from the TPLF activists and some of the spokespeople the way that they were picking it up the first year. maybe, just maybe, they did get a sense that they were also being played. I'm not saying they're completely, good actors in this, but if they hear enough people, including those of us from inside mainstream media, saying, hey, you are constantly regurgitating propaganda because your sources are Dr. Tedros Adhanom, a known TPLF executive member. Your sources are activists. I know that because I was seeing the content from them first, and then I was seeing it end up in CNN. So I don't think they completely want to throw away their credibility in this either. So I've seen that slow down a lot, which also, indicates that there's very little legitimate information to work with in order to paint the Ethiopian government in a certain way. So a lot of great things. Professor Beniam, thank you so much.
Thank you, Hermela.
We can follow you on Twitter. What's your handle?
Actually, I'm not on Twitter. I'm trying to. I know that's blasphemy, isn't it? How is that even
That sounds like
possible?
peace. Sounds like peace.
It does. It does.
Probably
It
so
does.
peaceful.
I'll eventually be there.
Yeah, I think we need you to get on there. I mean, you probably have to manage it, but we do need you to get on there. A lot of great comments, by the way. Hope you get to check them out later.